Good morning. My name is Alia Azariah. I'm Director of Aftercare for Safe House Project. I've been with Safe House Project since February of 2021. I'm also a person with lived experience. And so it's been my honor to get to do these webinars every month on different topics. Point of this webinar series has never been to provide a comprehensive training on any topic, but to just be a part of starting conversations, pointing people in the direction of other people who are wanting to have these conversations and uniting the field. Because something that we learned as a national organization as we were having a lot of conversations with local organizations and community-based organizations was that somebody here in Southern California, where I was looking for the same answers as somebody in upstate New York, and yet they weren't connected. So our hope has always been to unite the industry and continue to have just important conversations and build each other up. And so this month, we're going to be talking about trauma-informed faith practices in anti-trafficking work, which is, I think, a very important topic. As we all know, faith has the ability to uplift people, and it also has the ability, when used incorrectly or when used in a coercive way, to be really harmful to others as well. And so it's something that we're really, I think, as helpers in this field, regardless of your faith, something that we're always trying to do is remain helpers, right? And not people who harm. And so excited to bring this conversation to all of you. I'll start with Deanna, my friend Deanna. Deanna Lynn is Executive Director at Refuge for Women Kentucky. After surviving 10 years herself in the commercial sex industry, she sought healing from a residential program for sexually exploited and trafficked women. As she graduated from Refuge for Women in 2012, she's earned a master's degree from Asbury Theological Seminary. She's also authored 2 books: Purchased, Leaving the Sex Trade, and Integrated, Living Beyond the Sex Trade, detailing kind of both parts of her journey. And in addition to her role at Refuge for Women, she's a global consultant and speaker on anti-trafficking and anti-exploitation. She's a leader in Bible study fellowship. She's the weekend staff in her church's nursery, specifically in the littles class, 2 to 3-year-olds class. She loves learning, and she'll likely be a student for life. And so thank you, Deanna, for coming on and sharing your expertise on this. And then we also have Daisha Hamby. Daisha is Interim Executive Director for One Voice Home, which is a faith-based nonprofit dedicated to serving survivors of trafficking. She has a bachelor's degree in psychology. And through that, she discovered her love of understanding people. She's originally from Lubbock, and her path led her far from home to Uganda, where she spent 6 years in social work, where she witnessed the resilience of individuals facing extreme challenges and found her calling in serving vulnerable people. Family is the core of her life. She has 3 kiddos and a decade-long marriage. She's been in both corporate and nonprofit realms, but it's been her time in the trenches, walking along survivors and understanding the intricacies of trauma that really define her approach. So we really appreciate you guys taking an hour out of serving survivors directly to spend time helping us learn from your experience and your expertise and things that you all have implemented into your practices to make sure that we're approaching faith in a way that is helpful and not harmful. And so excited to kind of get to hear a little bit more from you all on your thoughts. So to jump in, I'd love to talk about, what is the importance of practicing faith-based programming in a trauma-informed way? Like, why are we having this conversation? So why is it important for faith-based organizations to practice faith-based programming in this way that is intentionally trauma-informed?
I mean, I think everyone knows that there's a significant amount of programs and organizations and services that are faith-based. And that's a widespread thing that we see faith-based organizations stepping into this work. And so I think it's super important to be very well informed that our culture of coming from a background of whatever it is, Christianese or religion or whatever you identify with as a faith, that we need that deserves just as much care when we're stepping into this space as our trauma work and understanding what trauma looks like and our expertise in trauma. Those can usually go hand in hand. And so because there's so many of us of faith in this field, I just feel like it is something that I've learned over my time working with survivors, and even in my work in Uganda, you need to approach it very delicate and very respectfully. And so I think it's an important conversation of how to do that, because it's why we do what we do. At least it is for me and One Voice Home. We do it because of our relationship with Jesus, but we need to have a very well robust knowledge and understanding and approach to those that don't have that same viewpoint or experiences that we have.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think probably everyone here has a pretty high value on safety. I mean, when you're looking at the needs of any human being, like safety is like the most basic need. And so when we're thinking about safety in terms of spiritual care, we have to understand that, a lot of women, religion was part of their abuse. So they knew the Bible well. Their parents who trafficked them would tell them to honor their mother and father. You come into a program and you're learning that you need to submit to men, depending on what kind of tradition and how you interpret certain passages. And so things like that. The other form of safety that we really want to provide with our spiritual care is, like you said, like not everyone, making sure that everything is safe in terms of the language that we're using, not using a language that automatically like people shut down because they can't connect to the word or the tradition or the denomination and stuff like that, but also in a sense of like deliverances and like these supernatural experiences, and which I'm sure we'll get into later. But I think the main reason it's important is because we want to provide a sense of safety, and how we go about how our faith informs what we do. I think is going to provide the biggest sense of safety over anything that we could, they need a place where nobody's selling them anything. No one's selling them to somebody and no one's selling them anything.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think to kind of jump off of what you said, Daisha, and part of why we wanted to have this conversation is we at Safe House Project are not a faith-based organization. We certainly have people who are people of faith that serve on our organization. We have this conversation often internally, but what we've also found through our grant process through certification is that, at least for the programs that we've interacted with as not a faith-based organization, more than 80% of them have been faith-based orgs that are doing this, at least restorative care residential programming in the US. And so really important that we're having this conversation, because we've seen a gambit of how faith is practiced in residential specifically, from everything from very heavy required faith-based requirements to, hey, we're faith-based because of how we were founded, and that is not really a part of our everyday, and kind of everywhere in between. But I've also found that this is a conversation that people have really been wanting as people have understood more about trauma-informed care. I've seen a lot of those organizations that at one point had a lot of required faith elements shifting and looking for answers, looking for how do we shift when we've been operating this way for 8 years and we're seeing the fallout of some of these requirements, and we're wanting to provide more agency to our residents. How do we make that shift and stay true to like their own beliefs and faith practices in the same way that they would want their residents to stay true to their own beliefs and faith practices, right? And so how can, in your all's experience as two organizations that have started this way or have shifted this way, how can faith-based organizations integrate faith into their services without imposing it on the people that they're serving? Daisha, you want to start us again?
Yeah. So, like you said, we actually started with the understanding that we did not want to impose faith on our survivors. Of course, it's still always been a growth thing, and we're always learning, but that was our approach from the beginning. And so I would say, going back on what Deanna said, like, in order to be trauma informed, they not only have to know that they're safe, they have to feel that they're safe. And that's felt safety. And if they are coming into an environment where I saw a comment that when Jesus is mandatory for support from one of our people, like that's immediate shutdown for us. And we see that. And our job, even if our faith is the one that's leading us, it is not my job to impose my belief of what will heal them or what will be their best support. And because that is, like you said, that was the coercion that they have used in the past. And I think it's super important that we recognize that there's fight, flight, freeze, and there's fawning, right? And those are your trauma responses. And so what we saw, even when we weren't imposing it, and none of our curriculum that is faith-based is required. They are not required to go to church. They are not required to participate in any faith activity unless that is something that they want to do. But even just we had to watch our language, like Deanna was saying, because like they would like be like, what are y'all talking about? Or like that doesn't resonate with me. But if they had one of their trauma responses was fawning, we would see them want to take on that language or become that person. And we don't want that. We want them to have their own journey. We want them to be discovering what they truly believe and what their core values and beliefs are. And so I think it's important to realize that like because trauma response can often be a fawning response, that's going against what we're trying to do in this healing space of rest is what I would say. So yeah, we realized from the beginning not to make anything mandatory with faith. And even with that, we still had a learning curve of the language that we used and just how we approached certain situations to be very sensitive to the fact of they're in different places than we are. And that's okay. That's what we want. We want them to be safe and feel like they can be who they are and not have to please us, or in order to stay in our program, they have to adapt our beliefs or the way that we approach certain situations.
Thank you.
I think having a background in recovery was really helpful for me because, just like alcoholism is no respecter of persons, human trafficking, exploitation is no respecter of religion, race, class, gender, like any of the things. And so when you're looking for a place to get well, like that needs to be the point. Like we're here to help you heal from your trauma. And while my faith does inform everything that I do, I don't need to be so explicit and overtly proselytizing anyone who comes over here for the sake of like my own standards or something. So I think just having an understanding of, having a background in recovery has been helpful. I'm sorry, can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, absolutely. So how can faith-based organizations integrate faith into their services without imposing it on the people they serve? So you're definitely on the right track with the question.
So, the thing that we have to remember, like, for most of us who went into a program, like we just did whatever anybody told us to do. If it meant that we might get a family, might get a sense of belonging, might have a home, might have provision, might have protection, might have our basic human needs met. And so when you go into a program, and ours was pretty heavily imposed when I went in the program in multiple ways. And like it would be easy to slip right into that and be like, well, these people care, I'll just do this thing next. But then how do you ever get to take ownership of your faith? And so I like that we've gone more towards I'm gonna let you know that faith is a big reason. Like faith is the why behind what we do, but we're gonna respect your values, respect your traditions. They have the option to opt out of curriculum and go with more of just like a trauma-based curriculum. I really like the idea, when I went through a program program 12 years ago, and a lot of people were doing this back then. I hated the fact that every time I went to church with these people, everybody knew my story just because of who I walked in with. And so I love that we're finding churches that maybe have like a coffee shop or something and giving people the option of like, we don't have to walk in together, like just meet us at the car, bring a book, whatever you're comfortable with, and kind of just making some of those subtle changes and allowing them to take, have more voice and choice in their own spiritual formation instead of like requiring it as part of a curriculum and them leaving and wondering, well, what just happened? Do I believe because they believed, or do I believe because I had my own encounter?
Yeah. And I
And
think
I'll
that's,
piggyback off oh, sorry.
no, go
I was
ahead.
gonna say, I'll back off of just different strategies that we've learned is we don't allow staff to take residents to church. We find we have a really great volunteer program, and we have volunteers that attend different churches. And so we give them the option to choose whatever church they want. We don't tell them you have to go to this church, or you have like, it is what do they identify with, and we allow them to try different churches that they feel like they can culturally relate to and make sure they feel comfortable. And if they're comfortable going on their own, we let them go on their own. If they want someone to go with them, we'll find a volunteer to go with them so that they have that support, but if they're not identified, like Dana said, because that's super important. And I'll go this way, and all you can tell me if it's another. I think another strategy that we've used is we do have our basic, guidelines of like, we accept all religions except for like Wiccan and satanic rituals. We don't like promote that in our home, but we do have girls that come in that want to use tarot cards and that crystals and things like that. And so what we have always done is like make space for that, but it's just not within our home. So they can have their tarot cards, they can have their crystals, but we just ask them to do that outside of like, if they like want to go outside and like and do something like that, just so that everyone feels like there's like everyone's being respected in what their practices are. And so we've seen that be very successful in just how people choose to walk out their spiritual belief or anything like that.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
I
I think
want to make one second, Deanna. I just want to make a comment. I usually give this disclaimer in the beginning, and I didn't, so this is my fault. If you could put your questions in the Q&A portion, if they're in the chat, I'm going to lose them. And I want to make sure that we have your questions because they're really great, and I want to make sure that we get them. So if you can put them in the Q&A so I have them all in one concentrated area and we can get to them towards the end of the webinar, that would be amazing. Thank you so much. Okay, go ahead, Deanna.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think it's important, that there are a few programs that will, probably dismiss for satanic, background, Wiccan and stuff like that. And, a lot of us had that in our background, or it was part of the abuse, or it was part of our searching and stuff like that. And we brought some really weird things into the home. Well, what things that I find, strange today, but going back to the safety piece, it's like we're able to say like, while they don't have to convert to our faith, there are also certain spiritual practices that would cause spiritual harm among the community. And here's some of those practices that we don't accept. And it gives them the choice. Like, would you feel safe here knowing that like we're going to accept you, but also like we don't allow these few things, and let them make an informed decision of like, do I want to come here and just deal with the trauma stuff and I can go back to my rituals later? And just giving them as much information as possible, but also not blanket saying like, no Wiccans allowed,
Yeah, I think that informed consent is really, really important and a very essential aspect of having a faith-based program that is trauma informed, is allowing residents the choice and knowledge of what they're stepping into and helping them decide whether that is going to be something that they're going to find healing in, or a way that they want to search for healing in that way, and a way that we walk away from being like coercive, right? So I think that's incredible. And something that we really need to go ahead.
I just want to make a little disclaimer on the weird part. Like when I say like some of my practices were weird, like, I mean, I actually carried a vial of my own blood. There's so much that like physically and spiritually harming in that sense. And so I don't want somebody to feel like excluded if that's what their current practices are. But to me, I was like, that had to go, you know, for the safety of the whole community.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think I appreciate some of the comments that you've made, Deanna, because as you mentioned, the program that we both went through, right, has really shifted. It started with a lot of very required faith-based practices. I also had the experience where we would go into church. It was a small church where everyone knew that who we were and what our stories were because of who we came in with. And yet, sites within the Refuge for Women umbrella have shifted. National has shifted. And so I think that it's just a really good example of how saying like, well, this is how we've always done things is not it's not a good enough reason, right? It's not something that we as a field are settling for anymore as we continually strive to serve survivors better. It is possible to shift and to change even when you've been established, a multi-site over a decade, right, organization. If an organization like that can shift some of their practices in to be intentionally more trauma informed, we can all do that in order to serve that way as well. So you both kind of brought up that part of the reason, not the entire reason, but part of the reason that we need to be intentionally trauma informed in faith practices is because many survivors have religious trauma in one way or another, whether it was part of what made them vulnerable, from excluding them from certain practices or certain spaces based on identity or based on other aspects, or maybe it was part of the coercion into exploitation, or maybe they've had previous helping experiences that were coercive with religion. But what are some of the strategies for faith-based organizations to recognize and address religious trauma in survivors? Daisha, do you want to start, or Deanna? Whoever wants to. Feel free.
What are what are strategies for what?
What are some strategies? Oh, it looks like we lost Deja. What are some strategies for recognizing, for faith-based organizations to recognize and address religious trauma in survivors?
Well, again, I think allowing them to lead the conversation, right? So one of the things that came up in our training last week is, you know, in a faith context, we could talk about things like generational curses or spirits of this, and as you know, we had volunteers who would renounce like critters and demons off of people, and it's just like that really scarred people. Like, I'm just carrying around demons and curses with me, like with no context. They don't understand. And so allowing them to ask questions, you know, like allow them to address the what they're here to heal from, let it kind of unpack naturally, but also ask you the why. Like, why do you do what you do? Or why do you seem so free? And then we get to tell them like our experience, but not putting all of those things on them. Allow them to lead the conversation of faith as they start to have questions, and be ready with different traditions, different religious backgrounds, because, you know, back then we were so heavily focused on one stream of interpretation, and that interpretation has been abused a lot, you know, depending on like how heavy like the patriarchal stuff has been. And then a lot of women left feeling like they're just out there tempting everyone just because they're a woman, right? And so it's like their responsibility to do all these things. So just being careful in having the conversation, but allowing them to ask the questions, and then have different people who can come at it from different lenses. Because I've got a woman right now who was being mentored by someone in a different faith stream, and it was basically his way or the highway. And it's like collectively all of this faith represents the image of God, and if we're only exposing them to one, and their mentors are shutting down any other tradition or making fun of other traditions that they don't understand why they interpret it that way, I think that ignorance is really harmful. So just having spiritual humility, like cultural humility, have some spiritual humility.
Yeah, I think humility is a great word to be using here. And I saw it in the chat, somebody talking about cultural humility. And I think that's something that I know the three of us have definitely had conversations around. But Dacia, I know that you got disconnected
Sorry,
there
I got
for a second.
disconnected.
No, it's okay. So I want to re-ask the question so that you can pop in here. What are some strategies that faith-based organizations can practice in order to recognize and address religious trauma in residents and survivors?
Yeah, I don't know what was said. I will say that we haven't had too much experience with, just to be honest, with extreme spiritual abuse of any residents that have come into our program. But we do in our intake process ask specific questions about, hey, have you been hurt by the church, or have you been hurt by religion, or people, and has any of your trauma been attached to a religion or a faith base? And we don't ask them to disclose all of their trauma in our intake, but that gives us the red flag that, hey, we need to move cautiously here, or we need to dive more deep into this once they get here and start working on their trauma. And so just making sure that you have those questions on intake so that you not diving into their history by any means, but just having those check marks of, hey, we just need to check back in here and we need to be sensitive here, and making sure your whole staff knows that, and making sure that the volunteers that are working with them know that. And I think some other strategies is in our volunteer training's pretty thorough. If they want to be with survivors, they have to go through 3 levels of volunteer training. And one of those is we have a whole thing on spiritual abuse and spiritual practices, because our staff can be trained in that, but it can kind of go a little sideways if you, with volunteers that don't have as much knowledge or background. And that's on us as the organization to put people in front of and people alongside of our survivors that have the knowledge of, like, hey, you can impose your faith on them. And if, like, just making sure your volunteers are also on the same page as you, and how you approach these very sensitive and important conversations.
Yeah.
I agree. We have a 3-part and the it's like the basics, like let's talk human trafficking. What does it look like here? What does it look like globally? Just a whole section on that, and then a whole section on trauma informed care, and then a whole section that they do just on spiritual.
Oh, we're losing everybody a little bit today.
Oh yeah, we actually have a list of like Christianese wording and phrases that really can kind of freak people out or turn people off, because we don't even realize that we're saying it, because it's just like our culture and it's a part of that. And so we provide that as well, so that just like we have all these things of like what not to say, we have that also for that type of language.
That's amazing. Thank you. I already see people in the comments saying that they would love to see that list if you would ever be willing to share it, Dacia. But I'm gonna kind of go off script a little bit. This question specifically for you, Dacia. So sorry to put you on the spot, but because I'm sure you'll be able to speak to it just fine. Because I keep seeing cultural humility come up in the chat and in the questions, and I know that One Voice Home, this is something that you guys have active practices around being culturally aware, culturally humble, and as a faith-based organization. I'm just wondering, like, can you speak specifically? Because I think that this kind of counteracts some of the areas where we see faith practices being harmful, is when we can counteract it with the cultural humility. Can you talk about some of the specific ways that One Voice Home has become intentionally culturally, trying to be intentionally culturally humble? There we
Yeah,
go.
I wouldn't say we will never arrive. I mean,
Exactly.
I
Right.
think that's a learning curve, but I would say a lot of it has to do with my experience in Uganda. Like, I think a lot of times when we are in the helping field and we have the right hearts and we have everything, we can go into a place that we feel like needs us. And so we bring all of this of like with good intentions, but we don't take the time to truly sit down with the culture or the people that we're working with and say, like, what do you need? And I'm not an expert, you are. So like, so that's our approach here, is like, how dare I sit down and tell you and Deanna, without being a lived expert, like what you need. That is like, so like I need to understand your culture. And we've seen all different types of cultures come into our program, from race to the type of home they were brought into to their spiritual background. And so I think for us, it's like taking that individual approach with every single person and understanding, like, hey, can we understand like and we do provide a core values and beliefs class, because we do believe that if they don't identify as faith, like everyone wants to know why they believe what they believe. And everyone wants to know, like, what are my core beliefs and my values that haven't been imposed on me, or I haven't had to do that in order to survive. What do I believe? And so I think having that cultural approach there is very important, to like give them that informed information of like, no, you can develop your own core values and beliefs, and it can look different. And we want to help you on that journey. And I just think being so humble, we actually do a huge exercise and practice with our volunteers and our staff. It's from Hands That Heal, and it's a really cool activity where everyone has different cue cards and you do certain things and you interact. And it's very interesting. And like, there's things that offend people and there's things that don't offend people. And it's very interesting because when they're done playing that game, talking about just different culturals and how we approach those things, no one ever took the most of the time, no one ever takes the time to say like, hey, why are you offended because of when I touched your hair? In your culture, that is offensive. But I kept trying to do it because that's what I do. There was like, I never saw anyone like take the recognition of like, oh, she's freaking out when I touch her hair. And that's a sign of disrespect in their culture. And it's like teaching people to ask the why behind the what, so that we can understand where they're coming from. And there can be understanding and like learning opportunities on both sides. And we just really try to explain that, like, even though all of their skin color may look the same, that's not always what cultural competency is about. It is digging deeper and understanding what their life has looked like, and how we can approach that with humility and meet them where they're at.
Thank you. Yeah, and Deanna, the reason I had kind of asked Asia that was in a way to getting specifically to their program, this question. But what Refuge, what or personally, what do you believe are practical tools that faith-based organizations can use to serve survivors without being coercive?
What are some practical tools to serve survivors without being coercive? I mean, I just think having options, having different options available, increasing the amount of choice, options that your team has agreed, like these are safe choices. But I just don't know that there was a lot of options back then. It was kind of like this is what we were going to do. Now, when I went through the program, it was just starting to become a 1-year program. I know it's kind of gone back and forth at the time since then, but at the time it went from 9 months to going into a 1-year program. And I got to have, as somebody in the program, I got to have a lot of input on what I needed. And because of the things that like I had seen growing up, I needed a lot of help relationally. And so they allowed me to kind of research some books and implemented some curriculum that would help me to finish the year out in the stage that I was actually in. So that was really helpful. However, a lot of those choices, I wasn't exposed to any other tradition. So it wasn't until seminary when I found out that certain passages and certain socio-historical contexts could really change the lens of how I read certain passages in the original language. And those options weren't given back then. And so making sure that if we are going to attack a subject matter, and if it is going to have some spiritual components to it, making sure that a few different theologians are being brought to the table, so that we don't walk out there and feel like I had no idea that this was even an option, or that it was even interpreted this way.
I know another thing, Deanna, that you all have shifted is like kind of how do we say this? De-incentivizing faith practices, right?
Yeah. So I think we had a conversation just like on the baptism component, like that was a huge thing for me. But again, it was something that I initiated, and I think we had talked about like celebrating all the milestones. Like we know, people of faith know why that decision is like the most important decision we'll ever make. But if somebody else doesn't know that, and they're feeling like in order to get the attention that this resident just got, they have to get baptized, like that's not good either. So being able to like celebrate, like the real celebration is going to be in heaven. So yeah, getting to right size the celebration in a way that is private and honors the person and their decision, but also making sure that you're taking just as much time to honor the decisions that other people are making in their own spiritual journey, because they might take a lot of different paths to get to their final decision of who they say, they are and who God is.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that that was a really important one. I remember that was definitely a practice that was happening when I was in program, and when you would get baptized and you would have a party and a cake and all of that, and just thinking like for those residents.
Ceremony.
Yeah, the whole deal, right? And so for those there, I think we all kind of learned like there were a lot of residents who rightly desired to be celebrated, right? And who either didn't get to have that experience because they chose to be really true to the path that they were on, or who had those experiences in a way that was coercive, or just because they desired this very normal thing, which is to be celebrated.
What my
And
sister's doing. I want mom and dad to celebrate me like
yeah,
that. Yeah.
exactly. And so I know that that's something you guys have done, is kind of de-incentivizing those practices. And
Well,
it's just,
another one that was really popular at the time. So when I came in, it was there, we had a more charismatic giftings. And so there was something called courtesy falls. So like a pastor would like put his hands on you and you'd fly back, and like you're being covered with blankets and stuff like that. And I'm not knocking the practice, because I have had experiences. However, no one touched me. It was just God. And so I have flown back a few times, and I'm thankful. Those are great experiences. However, they were like giving courtesy falls, like the girls were so like they wanted to affirm this pastor's gift, so they would just fall down. It's like, what? Why are we even, like, why is that an option? I remember thinking like, I don't want my faith to be a show. And so when I did have that experience, it was private. Again, nobody touched me. Someone just prayed over me. I was glued to the floor for 3 hours. I was like, that was between me and God. But then you go to like a church, and like I had somebody who was like pushing my like head hard and renouncing all kinds of things off of me that I didn't feel like I was actually dealing with. I actually felt spiritually violated. I had to have someone pray over me afterwards because I felt spiritually violated. And just with any gift, our natural gifts, whether we're an athlete or we have spiritual gifts, they all need practice. I get that. But when you're going through a program and that's just the norm, we have to be really careful about even those practices, because what I would see happen is my sisters in the program and we would begin to start seeking experiences with God instead of having a right devotion to God. And because our experiences used to be so extreme, we would seek out these experiences. And then when you don't have that felt presence and you don't have that felt experience, we start to question our faith. And so I think we have to be really careful with practices like that. Though supernatural encounters can be great, but
I think that that
And I'll say,
conversation is so much bigger than just in the survivor space and in the survivor care space, right? Like that's a practice that we see. I see people talking about it in the chat that have had that experience, outside of care, right? Like we see that in faith practices, completely unrelated to survivor care. And then when it carries over, that's where we see like this, it's like a very harmful place for those things to carry over, even more harmful than they are in the church already, which they're harmful in the church already, even without the feeling of trauma. But go ahead. Go ahead,
I
Deja.
was gonna say another thing that we do, going off of what Deanna said and those experiences, because I'm with Deanna. Like I believe that God can move in incredible, awesome ways, or he wouldn't be God. But we have to be careful, because I have seen it be abused and it be used as a tool of making people feel like, well, why won't he heal me? And so we get a lot of requests from churches like, hey, do your survivors want to come to this conference? Do they want to come hear this speaker? And we will do our due diligence to do a background check of what they will be talking about and what it will be doing, because we don't want to take anybody, even if they like, and it's always a choice again, they don't have to go, but even if they willingly go, I don't want something like that happening. And one of their sisters in the program gets healed, and they're sitting there going, well, what's wrong with me? And that's just a very hard thing to navigate. And so we kind of do some due diligence on the program side of what we are actually sending them to and endorsing as a program.
Thank you. And we're going to shift into some of the Q&A. And I know that like this is a question that I know that both of you have like talked about internally, and something that I know we're hoping to talk more and more about. But in your opinions, what can faith-based orgs do to be more inclusive in services and in accepting and of survivors who identify in the LGBTQ plus population?
I'll go first. Deanna already said this, but this is what we believe too. We're here to work on their trauma, not their sexual identity, not their faith. We are, even though that's like, again, we don't shy away from that we are that, but our job as a staff is not to work on or to approach or to make the focus their sexual identity. It is the trauma, and making sure that they feel safe knowing that, and that they feel safe coming in knowing that we're not gonna approach that subject. We're gonna love them as who they are and where they're at. And I think we don't have anything in our curriculum that disqualifies or discriminates against that. And so I think you just have to be, again, just very humble and very gracious in that, and just make sure you're, as a faith-based organization, you're working on the trauma and not the sexual identity piece of it.
Yeah, I think if you could sum like in one line, right? I think that is like a perfect one line phrase. Like, we're here to work on the trauma, right?
Yeah.
We're here to work on the trauma and not
Mhm.
anything else. That's really powerful. Deanna, do you want to add to that at all?
I think for us that like, I mean, a lot of the healing components, the reason I came to Refuge for Women is because I had already been to psychiatric institutions, I already been to rehabs. What I needed to learn how to do was relate to humanity again. And so I think a lot of what we could do in our healing process is relational healing. And so while we at Refuge for Women, like we're not actively in relationships like in most of our programs, like we're not dating, we're not having sex. And that's it. Like, it's just a kind of a blanket thing, because like we're trying to discover who we are at the time, and we need a break from that. And so as far as when they do start navigating relationships again, we've had people in all kinds of relationships. And so I think my focus has just been like, the love and the respect piece, right? Like my focus is, are you not going back to abusive relationships? Because that's the thing that takes a lot of women out, is getting into an abusive relationship. So I think just really focusing on like, what are you learning relationally, and how are you taking these tools into your relationship is really more of our focus than us telling them who they can and cannot date, but allowing them to make decisions based on, is this healthy for me, and who do you want to become, and are these decisions helping me to become that person, and is this person helping me to become that person? And that's really where the conversation stays.
Amazing. Thank you. I'm going to try and find some more questions that are really overarching. And Deja, you touched a little bit on this, and so did you, Deanna, but maybe we can kind of circle back to it. What have you all done to offer, like if there is a survivor who wants to learn more or practice a different faith, whether they're Jewish or Hindu or Muslim, what have you done to allow them to discover those things or practice those things? And what have you done if maybe there aren't those practices in your area?
Well, I'm just really blessed because
I will be honest.
Go ahead,
No,
Deanna.
go.
I'm really blessed because I'm right down the street from like some really awesome schools, right? And I've got great professors, and part of what we had to do was ethnographic research in different religions and stuff like that. And so I feel like we have a lot of good people out here who could point them who we can point to answer questions, because I can't be culturally competent in something that I am not fully immersed in, right? And so getting to introduce them to people who can answer those questions, like God's not afraid of our questions. Where we seek to find where religion is right, and we test everything against against each other, and help them to make an informed decision. So I just think we have a lot of great professors out here, and a lot of pastors, and we have the ability to help them do like their own kind of ethnographic research when they start. I think it's a beautiful phase to be in. I think it really will help them to take ownership of their own walk if we introduce them to people who can actually answer the questions without any type of unconscious bias of their own spiritual background.
I mean, we have not had anyone yet that have identified as Muslim, Jewish, or Hindu, but I would say, if that came along, we do have those resources here, and I would lean into those resources and give, like what Deanna said, we've had people that come in and they're like, okay, I have some pretty intense questions that I'm wanting answered. And we always get outside sources to come in. And so I've set up outside meetings, like what Deanna was saying, with people that can give insight so that it's not our staff. And they are getting, make sure that it's yeah, that we're going outside of our own network and making sure that we are bringing the people to the table that can really answer those questions. And so we've set up meetings like that with survivors who come with questions that are really hard to answer, and those have been very fruitful.
Yeah. Thanks. I know that I was definitely one of those survivors that came and had a lot of questions around practices and theology, and wanted to challenge what people believed, volunteers and staff members. So I can just say I know I really appreciated people intentionally taking the time to do that when I was a resident. And I see people have raised their hands. Just we don't unmute people during the webinars. It tends to take a lot of time to get through kind of doing that when we start to unmute people. But if you can leave your question in the question and answer, hopefully we will have time to get to it. I also am going to take some of these questions that we didn't answer, and I'll send them to our panelists to see maybe if they have a specific answer, or want to share some of that. There's been a lot of questions, Deja, around that list of Christianese that you give that you don't use. But I want to give you both the opportunity. Is there anything else that you'd want to add on this topic before we sign off for the day?
I was going to just share an experience that we've had, just to encourage those that are like, well, how do you do this? So, like, your desire is to see people to come to know Jesus, and how do you do that without displaying it? Or like, yes, you display it, but how do you do that without making it a requirement? Or how do you do that without making it a coercion thing? And I'll tell you the two we've had a lot that have come in that want nothing to do, like they cringe when we talk about church or religion or God or Jesus, and we respect that. And we really watched ourselves around that. But these two who came in that way were curious, and we just allow that curiosity to lead them instead of us leading that. So I would just encourage you to let their own curiosity and their own questions to lead the journey. And as they lead, you answer. And I will say with those two, it was not us that led them to the decision to believe in God. God showed up in a dream to one of them, and the other one, she was like, God, are you real? And a track blew up at her feet in the moment that she asked that question. And so we love that, because the two people that came into our program that had nothing to do with faith ended up finding faith, but it had nothing to do with the staff. We were not a part of those moments. And so I just want to like encourage you, like those things can happen when you don't have to be a part of those moments, because God will, and it's better because like it's real. Like we knew that we didn't do anything or to like came running to us, telling us about their personal experience, kind of like what Deanna was saying, like she's had her own personal private experiences. So I just want to encourage faith-based, like they're like, but how does that work? Well, he's God and he will do it if he wants to, and he doesn't need us to do it.
Yeah,
That
isn't
was
that
great.
great? Like it saves us from that savior messiah complex, right? Like it's not our harvest, it's his. And we're like ultimately he will glorify his name and he will do it again. And I also want to encourage, like, don't underestimate the power of prayer. Like you can pray for people and really like stand in the presence of God and advocate on their behalf. Like if we're going to be allies for them here, like be allies, you know, in the throne room of God. And I think for me, again, having a recovery background, like I'm 17 years sober, I still go to meetings and it's a safe place for all alcoholics to come. And the more that I know my Bible and the more that I know my recovery materials, the more I see where it was inspired by God, you know. But again, you can't really be like competent in something unless you're immersed in it. And so because I have those two experiences, I'm able to see that. But what I find beautiful is like I don't have to explicitly say who my God is, because people come up to me quite often and say, I know who your God is, just simply in how I live and how I love. And then they're inclined to ask me questions. And then we get to dig in together. But like I may only get to water, someone else gets to plant. And, you know, we never know which part is ours. But yeah, the harvest is his, and pray and don't underestimate, like he can use all things like that go beyond our human faculties.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think that's a great place for us to wrap up. And I just appreciate you both coming on and being so open and talking about this. I'm sure we have a mix of people who have attended, and certainly we'll have a mix of people who will watch this recording afterwards. But really appreciate you both being able to come on, be vulnerable, share kind of how those things have worked and not worked. And thank you to the attendees for wanting to be a part of this conversation. The fact that you are here, the fact that you want to listen to these, it helps me believe and have faith that we as a field are moving forward, that we're wanting to serve survivors in the best way that we possibly can. And I'll send out an email next week that'll have this recording. It'll have any final thoughts from the panelists that they've wanted to share and some links to their organizations. So if you have more questions or if you want to learn a little bit more about what they do or how they do things, you can do that as well. All right, everyone, I hope you have a great weekend and a happy 4th of July.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alia.
Yeah, bye-bye.